Let's talk about political violence in New Mexico. This week, we are jumping right in to talk about this topic that has been rising around the US. We've seen a lot of incidences of this, and I feel like people are becoming more aware. Certainly there was an assassination attempt on a candidate last year when during the campaign. We saw a lot of kind of heated and intense violent rhetoric increase. And then this year, there was an arson attempt on the Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro's house. We saw political assassinations in Minnesota on a lawmaker and their partner. We've certainly seen other incidences that have been popping up. And so this seems to be really top of mind. And it came up a bunch for New Mexico legislators in the recent special session. A number of lawmakers kind of stepped up to talk about this. And Lucas, I want to ask you to jump in and maybe just give us a sense of like what the overall mood was. And then let's talk a little bit specifically as well about Rod Montoya, who is kind of a prominent figure in the New Mexico Republican Party. So I'll just sort of stop there and see, if you can give us a kind of the lay of the land.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. So yeah, last week during the special session, in both chambers, in the House and the Senate, both meetings started on Wednesday with some acknowledgement of political violence. They were, sort of specifically talking about Charlie Kirk and some of the rhetoric that's come out from that. Um, but for the most part, on Wednesday, everybody sort of dove right into business after those sort of acknowledgments were made. But then on Thursday, when the House came to order, the a number of GOP representatives took the opportunity for points of personal privilege to sort of diatribe about political violence and their views on it. But one in particular really, really stuck out to me, and that was Rod Montoya, as you mentioned, a very prominent figure, has been the minority leader for the Republicans, has a very prominent social media presence, and records himself, talking and diatribing on his own platforms, and really pushing a lot of that far right rhetoric. Um, and he dove right in. Speaking of diving right in, he dove right in, going after Speaker Martinez for a Facebook post that the speaker had posted, um, that like called the president a name and referenced that people that supported the president were, let's just say not good people. Um, and he equated that to overt political violence, and he actually used the frame of a firearm, saying that the speaker, through his speech, had cocked the gun. Um,
And then, Mr. Speaker, I see your words saying those are the fascists. I'm not saying that you are pulling the trigger, but Mr. Speaker, you're cocking the gun.
and that was very troubling language to me, especially as he sort of continued to talk, because he went on a long thing about fascism, which, I will just say he got completely wrong, in terms of like the historical attributes of what fascism is in its historical context. And he also went on to like make some pretty bold claims that like fascism and capitalism are incompatible, which we're going to get into a little bit later. But I think for this context, for talking about political violence and what we're experiencing in this country right now, this moment we're in, um, what was really troubling is that, what we've seen is that phrase, right, cocking the gun, right, are accusing the speaker, who is a Democrat, of cocking the gun of political violence. That puts supporters of Montoya, right, people on the right, that puts them in a mindset of self-defense, right? Because the feeling is that there is literally a gun pointed at them. Um, and I know that it's all figurative, it's all speech, but given the everything that you've listed and some of the things we're going to get into, that is extremely inflammatory language that puts people in harm's way in a real, real way.
Yeah, I mean, I listened to the clip too, and there's definitely some conversation to be had about, kind of some of the points you're making, fascism, capitalism, et cetera. And, at one point, I think he even said, the right cannot be fascists. What did he say? It was something like that. It was, oh yeah, he said the right cannot be fascist because we don't believe in government control.
Give yourself over to government. And Mr. Speaker, the right cannot be fascist because we do not believe in government control.
Which, okay, so just going to leave that little commentary alone because there's a whole lot of government interference and government control of our basic lives and freedoms right now. And I think most Americans and most New Mexicans recognize that. Of course, how we fall down in terms of our feelings about the specifics are different. But, ultimately, any person in a position of power has to know that when they use that type of rhetoric around bombs, guns, weapons, violent language, that they have a responsibility to, to ask that question of like, is this increasing the likelihood that there's going to be violence, or is it reducing the likelihood? And, I think I always go back to kind of like the reality, which is, as you're pointing to, we should be talking about things like fascism and authoritarianism. And it's not just fascism when the other side does it, right? If the behavior and the action and the activity is problematic and there's a real serious infringement of our basic rights, that's something we should all be really concerned about when we see it happening. So, saying cocking the gun, I mean, that's such a specific and real reference. So I think that you're pointing to something that's really, really relevant and important. And I don't think we should ever gloss over that. And I also want to say, I think it's real, whether it's in the comment sections or at the legislature, but certainly it's amplified in a legislative session. That if you're going to use that type of phrase or language, you should really pause and think about it more carefully. But I wouldn't characterize Rod Montoya as somebody who thinks about it carefully. And, maybe you can say a little bit more about like what we know about him, because he does have kind of a history of saying these kinds of things and uplifting some pretty problematic stuff.
Yeah, and yes, we, like I said, he has a fairly active social media, and and he has shared some pretty disturbing things on there, including this Hitler meme, um, which is in pretty poor taste. I think no matter who you are, um, and so when we talk about political violence, words are words and speech is speech, but sharing, that kind of an image is certainly it invokes something, right? It certainly invokes a lot of feelings if you know anything about who Hitler is and what he did. Um, and then maybe even more disturbing is that he sort of proudly shared this video, and we'll share a screenshot of it. Um, that is from this European woman who has been preaching about the Great Replacement theory, which is this very white supremacist theory on non-white people attempting to physically replace white people in predominantly white countries. That there's a deeper history there that's obviously rooted in white supremacy and all of that. But so so Rod Montoya is I mean it's pretty rich, right? It's pretty rich to have somebody claiming that the speaker's personal opinions about the president is not just inciting rhetoric or whatever, but to like really escalate it to that sense of physical violence, when he is actually like overtly sharing these at the very least troubling, disturbing images and videos. um and I would argue, having watched that video, that there is a pretty overt call to action on behalf of that woman, when it comes to what needs to be done. And so for him to be sharing that is, again, sort of like pretty indicative of somebody who is themselves not at all concerned about what kind of a message they're spreading to their listeners and followers.
Yeah, and just for context for folks who aren't familiar, like, Rod Montoya represents part of New Mexico. It's in the northwestern part of the state. Um, don't know his entire personal history, but like certainly a white European Christian nationalist who is advocating for, anti-immigrant rhetoric and essentially eliminating, this is the kind of language that these types of, white nationalists in Europe use, eliminating people and groups of people. I mean, there's certainly a degree of irony, but also not in a jokey way, some really serious implications because that's precisely the rhetoric that was used to erase our native and indigenous tribes, nations, and pueblos here in New Mexico as well as around the U.S. And so that's really no joke, but especially when we look in a place like northwestern New Mexico, where the Navajo Nation and the history of that genocide and that colonial kind of project is still present in many ways. So for him to be kind of like, trying to use both sides of that coin, I think is also something that really, raises the specter of violence. And who I, couldn't say what he's aware of or not aware of, but I don't think that's appropriate for the leader of the Republican Party and somebody in the state legislative session to be kind of uplifting that type of stuff and then also pointing the finger back like, yeah, that's creating the problem. That's not helping or addressing political violence. It's advancing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And his, um, during his sort of diatribe, he bounced around a lot of issues, but the sort of, his attempt at sort of, 1984 like newspeak definition of fascism that excludes, him because he's a capitalist. Which real quick, diversion here.
Yeah, break that down. Break down
Yeah,
for us. I know that
yeah,
bothered you, and it caught me too, for sure.
yeah. Rod Montoya. So during his thing, he's talking about the how fascism and capitalism are incompatible. And while certainly it could be argued that the true politics of this country are capitalist rather than democratic or even republicanism. That's certainly not the rhetoric that you hear from mainline GOP, right? Is that this is a republic. And it would appear that Mr. Montoya actually ascribes to capitalism as the highest form of political um, uh, what like that's I guess that's his politics, but
I mean, he kind of places it even above like religious or faith-based ideology. It's like
yeah,
capitalism is we worship this and not free market capitalism, but this like kind of authoritarianistic, like control at all cost capitalism. And
yeah,
yeah, I mean, extreme, as we obviously could talk about it in a different setting, like the extreme results of capitalism where greed is the absolute most important thing. And, the people who own all of the assets and the wealth and the power get to impose their will on the rest of us. Yeah, that sounds a lot like a fascist kind of set of behaviors and systems, right? And there's a whole other analysis there, but it just is sort of rich for him to be trying to separate them in that way because it's just
right.
not what we're looking at. Yeah.
Yeah, but just to kind of get back to it. So yeah, he was using this like, newspeak version of his interpretation of fascism. And I just think that, it is it based on his voting history, based on the many speeches that I've sat through in all my years watching the House. um, his deeply held belief is that his worldview, his and I would say that's all encompassing. It's his specific kind of religion. It's his specific view of politics. Um, that it is some kind of an objective, correct way of thinking, and that everybody else who doesn't think that way is um, is incorrect and right and not it's not a sort of a differing of opinions. It's that they're wrong. And so yeah, so it's on its face just completely counters, this argument that it is in fact in this case Speaker Martinez or the Democratic Party of New Mexico trying to enforce that set of beliefs. when what we've seen, at least in like specifically looking at the special session, was this was an effort to make it so that people like in his community, right, in the rural northwestern part of the state, continue to have access to healthcare and food assistance. Um, and it wasn't a a USSR style, like you will get your healthcare and your food from the state. It was a like, if you need help, we will pass this legislation to help you. Um, People like Rod Montoya, who don't need that kind of assistance, are not forced to get it. Um, Meanwhile, based on his voting record and based on things he said in the past, it would seem to me that were he in more power, were he the speaker and his party in power, that he would try to pass legislation that would dictate how people live their lives. And so yeah, just on its face, his whole thing was speaking of incompatible, right? It was incompatible with even just what he was saying.
Yeah, and I'll place a little extra context, and then I think you can close this out because it's really well said. Like we've talked about this before, how democracy and a democratic republic, the form that we have, is about constraints of power. That's why we have a constitution. If you go all the way back and do your history lessons, our nation's founding, imperfect as it was, with lots of really serious flaws, some we have fixed, some we have not. It was about constraining power. Nobody wanted the king to come in and tax people and dominate people and have soldiers quartered in our cities and towns, controlling our daily lives. Like, just not something that anybody would accept. And so it was about constraints of power. And I think at a very basic level, what Montoya has sort of argued here, and I think in other places, is like, we don't need constraints on power because we're right. And it's like, that's not, the whole point of the project is to admit that, like, there's a bigger picture and that we have to figure it out together. That's the point of having a political system and consensus and working back and forth. And if you don't like that and you're saying, let's cock the gun instead, even if you're having a disagreement, you're advocating and I think activating people to go outside the political system. And that's where this political violence comes from. Instead of encouraging people and saying, yeah, we should be involved and engaged no matter what our disagreements are. So ultimately, for someone in his position to be advocating for that, I think it makes the problem worse and it increases the likelihood of political violence. It doesn't reduce it, and that's really important. So I just wanted to say that, and then if you want to kind of close us out with anything else that you think is worth knowing about it.
Yeah, and I'm really, really glad that you brought in that last point, because I think that is something solid we can close out on, is that idea of the constraints of power, and like sort of examining again, like, what is political violence, right? Um and I a part of Montoya's, he referenced it specifically in this same long diatribe on the House floor last Thursday. Um and in this case he was speaking about immigration, and he was talking about the both his personal and his party's belief that New Mexico has open borders with Mexico, and that there are violent criminal elements just flooding across the border on a daily basis. I've just for reference for our listeners and watchers out there, I've lived here in Las Cruces, 40 miles north of the border, my entire life. That is just not the reality that we experience. Never has been and is not now.
You mean
And
those
I
clips of like 8 people crossing the border that get replayed on Fox News? That's not like millions of people. It's just 8 people.
sad to say, no, it's not. No.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think that, like, it's worth pointing out that, like, um again, Montoya specifically, and it's worth saying out loud, his party, have used that fear rhetoric.
Mr. Speaker, there are other people who are coming here that could care less about being American. And you know this because they're burning things down and they're waving a flag of another country. To them, I want them to go back home because they're dangerous to society.
To justify to all of us and to themselves that armed state intervention on behalf of the actual military and or the National Guard and or elevating our police into these, hyper militarized tacticians, um, are not only, necessary but good. And so that, that also found its way into his speech, right? And I think that, so when, we can kind of finish on this, but like when we examine what political violence is, right, and like air quotes around political violence to separate it from the concept of sort of like real world actual violence, um, you know, political violence is and has been enacted on certain elements of our population throughout the history of this country, right? Whether it's slavery, whether it is, um, redlining, whether it is, our immigration laws that have favored people from predominantly white countries over non-white countries. Any host of political, policy oriented pieces of of legislation or other policies that have oppressed us, any one group of people, that is a form of political violence. And there have been those of us, saying that part out loud for years and years and asking others to say it out loud and recognize it out loud for years and years. And it is only now that, as violence is being enacted, on the streets in this, sort of tragic real world way, that we start hearing, Montoya and his side of the aisle using the term political violence to describe that violence. And I think that's very telling, about how they view violence, right? Violence can only be enacted, um, on them, through physical means, and everything else is, that's just words, that's just policy. So, and I say that as the sort of final, like, hypocritical point of Montoya's diatribe towards Speaker Martinez, is that, for him to sort of be utilizing that language, that Speaker Martinez's speech is somehow inciting violence, is, yeah, that's the highest form of being hypocritical. I think that we can close out on.
Yeah, and I think, the phrase that always comes up for me is like, is this helping or hurting?
Yeah.
And, ultimately, if we agree to be trying to make New Mexico better, to be trying to engage in this project of like caring about our neighbors and providing for each other and making our state safer and healthier and more prosperous, things that we all generally kind of say out loud and go, yeah, that makes sense. We want that, regardless of how we think we should get there. Is it helping or hurting? I think this type of grandstanding, this type of like language is hurting. And I think anybody in a position of power, regardless of party or affiliation or ideology within that party, needs to be asking that question right now, because the reason we're in this sort of highly agitated state where more and more people are resorting to using guns and death threats and other things that are happening in public spheres, schools, other public spaces, et cetera, is like they're being activated by this kind of stuff. And so, is this helping or hurting? I think that's the question that we have to keep forcing our elected leaders to answer, as hard as it may be at times to understand, all the ways, as you're pointing to, that political violence really plays out.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's it. I think we did it.
Cool. All right. See y'all next time.
See ya.